Can China be a military superpower? Beijing has outlined its defence plans that include a modern and advanced army. It's also accused the US of undermining global stability. So how will this defence policy play out, both in the Asia-Pacific region and beyond? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Hala Mahieddine. Global military competition is on the rise and China believes it's lagging behind. Beijing says the US has increased its defence budgets, modernised its weapons and developed its capability in cyberspace and space itself. Well, the Chinese government wants to catch up. It's detailed how it intends to do just that in a national defence paper released on Wednesday. Beijing has declared it wants greater modernisation of its armed forces and weapons. It says its ambitious plans are peaceful, but not if Taiwan tries to achieve independence from the mainland. China's Defence Ministry has warned it's ready to go to war to safeguard its national unity and says it will take all necessary measures to defeat those it calls separatists. Let's hear what China's spokesperson had to say.
The building and growth of China's defense capability is based on its own justified security demands. Its growth has always been the growth of the force for world peace. The white paper has clearly demonstrated China's policy of not pursuing hegemony. The theory that a strong country must seek hegemony will never apply to China. No matter how China is developed in the future, we will not threaten anyone, neither will we seek spheres of influence. There are still big gaps between China's defense expenditure and its demands of maintaining the national sovereignty, security and interests, complementing its obligations as a major power and maintain the progress of its own defense level. We will continue to keep a proper and stable growth of expenditure.
Well, the island of Taiwan is self-ruled, but China sees it as part of its own territory. The US has angered Beijing by approving sales of weapons to the island this month, sales worth more than $2 billion. Well, China says it won't allow the island to split from the mainland.
We are willing to strive for the prospect of peaceful reunification with utmost sincerity and efforts. However, we have to be very clear that seeking Taiwan independence will meet a dead end. If anyone dares to separate Taiwan from China, the Chinese army will certainly fight resolutely, defending the country's sovereign unity and territorial integrity.
Well, the Mainland Affairs Council, Taiwan's top policy-making body on China, condemned Beijing's remarks in a statement. It said, "We urge Beijing authorities to renounce irrational, malicious acts such as the use of force and to improve cross-strait relations and handle issues including Hong Kong rationally so it can be a responsible regional member." Well, let's have a look at China's military power. China's People's Liberation Army is the world's largest military force with more than 2 million soldiers on the ground, in the air and at sea. President Xi Jinping says he wants to transform the PLA into what he calls a world-class force capable of winning wars anywhere by 2050. China has cut the size of its land-based army by around 50% and significantly boosted its naval and air forces as parts of that plan. And it's investing heavily in modernising its military equipment. China's defence budget is the world's second largest after the United States. Its military expenditure for this year is set at more than $175 billion. President Donald Trump has demanded the US 2019 defence budget be increased to $750 billion. Well, let's bring in our panel. In Bangkok, via Skype, we have John Gravatt. He's an analyst at Janes by IFS Market, a defence and security consultancy. In DC, we're joined by Lawrence Korb. He served as US Assistant Secretary of Defence and is now a senior fellow at the Centre for American Progress. And in Berlin, we have Adam Nee. He's a China researcher at Macquarie University in Sydney and a visiting fellow at the University of Hamburg. Welcome to you all. I'd like to start in Berlin, if I could, with Adam Nee. What would you say we've learned from this white paper?
I think the white paper is a strong political statement. It didn't present any real strategies or any surprise for these of us that watches China's military, but it's a very strong political statement about how China sees its regional and international environment, how it sees the role played by the US, which is counterproductive and destabilizing in the view of Beijing, but as well as some other bits which I think are critically important. And one of these is how internal security has become such a big part of China's national security that it's being elevated to the top of Beijing's priority for its armed forces, but as well as the focus on political loyalty of the armed forces as well.
Thanks very much for that, Adam. Let's cross to Washington, D.C. now, and Lawrence Korb. We heard there this is China's statement defining its role in the world. What would you say China's message is with this document, and how is the US likely to interpret that?
Well, China's message is that, unlike our own document, they're not a strategic competitor to us worldwide, that they're basically protecting their own interests, and also that their military is getting more and more powerful, particularly in their region, what we call the Indo-Pacific region, and they will protect their interests. And again, as they've been doing ever since the revolution, that Taiwan is part of China, and we're not happy with the United States continuing to provide military assistance there. And if you should think about becoming separate, we will use our military force to prevent Taiwan from doing that, even if the U.S. aids them.
Do you think, Lawrence Korb, this is a shot across the bow then? A more emboldened China is now ready to say, we are ready at this point to take military action, and it's time for the U.S. to back off?
Well, basically, they're saying that, they're on their way to doing that. They said by 2050, they're going to be a world-class military. But the fact of the matter is, in their region, they're also very, very powerful. They also they complain about the U.S. being a global power and messing around all the world. They don't talk about their Belt and Road Initiative, which is destabilizing in a lot of parts of the world.
OK, raising two very interesting points there, Lawrence Korb, the Belt and Road Initiative and the perceptions of the United States. I want to raise these two issues during the course of our discussion. But John Gravatt, if I could just come to you, how do you interpret this white paper and this statement from China on the state of its military and the direction that it's going in? What's the main takeaway for you?
Well, I mean, the statements so far are right in as much that this shows China's determination to retain its sovereignty over Taiwan and control that situation, and also the message to the US. But there's also a lot of holes, I think, in the white paper that was issued today. There's a lot of ambiguity, and there's a lot of areas that China doesn't really provide many details on. For example, military bases, international military bases. It talks a little bit about the one in the Horn of Africa, but nothing else. In other examples include the scope of military modernization and capabilities that China is looking to deploy. Very little information about that. The main thrust certainly is that the Taiwan aspect. The Taiwan situation was not apparent in the 2015 white paper. only passing reference. And so this is the real main takeaway in this 2019 white paper. And the reason for that is because the United States has played a much stronger role under President Trump, I think, certainly in supporting Taiwan. And that is the main message here. But like I say, there is a number of ambiguities in the white paper. You know, China uses the white paper, I think, really to show that it is becoming more transparent and more open about its military objectives. But I think it doesn't really, it's failed to do that, I think, certainly. And I think that would be a noticeable aspect of it in the United States.
Adam Nee, if I could come to you. You mentioned there the focus on this white paper. It has the contrast with the previous white paper in 2015, which was more focused on an external perspective. Now the focus, one could interpret it as being a more internal one, focusing on China's domestic stability, what it views as its territories. Do you think in some way it signals a new determination for the Chinese to take more concrete action when it comes to Taiwan? Or is this more of a diversionary tactic to focus more on the internal and domestic policies while quietly expanding influence overseas?
I think certainly the domestic aspects has become top of Beijing's agenda. If you look at the 2015 Defense White Paper, Taiwan, Tibet, and Xinjiang is not explicitly mentioned, although it is implied. But in this case, they have been incorporated into the tasks and missions of the Chinese military. So it's very clear that this has elevated importance for the Chinese party state. The other thing is that there's added language with reference to maintaining political security, maintaining social stability. So very much code of language for maintaining the control of the party.
OK, one of the other big messages from this was the fact that the US is undermining global stability. I'd like to examine that. Adam, staying with you, in what way is the US undermining global stability according to this white paper and this report?
Yeah. So in Beijing's view, the U.S. is pursuing what it called hegemonism. So essentially, security at the cost of others, and being able to exercise a degree of power that it sees as illegitimate, right? But also in the region, in Beijing's view, the United States is increasingly antagonistic towards Beijing, whether that be in the South China Sea or with reference to Taiwan. And indeed, the reinforcement of the US alliance networks and deployments and other forms of intervention in the region and beyond. Its unilateralism as well, its enhancement of its military capabilities. So all of that threatens Beijing and is perceived by Beijing as potentially threatening of its national interests.
Lawrence Korb, would you or would the US accept these arguments that it's America that's undermining global stability?
No, obviously, the United States feels that it's in the region because we're asked to be there by our allies, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Australians, and we're there to help protect them. For example, if the Chinese try and take over some of the islands that traditionally have belonged to Japan, we would prevent that. And obviously, we would come to the defense of Taiwan if, for example, the Chinese decided that they waited long enough and they had to use force to unify the island. So we feel that we're there to provide the stability, and the Chinese are the aggressors. I think it's very interesting now we've tightened our ties with India. It used to be the Pacific Command, now it's the Indo-Pacific Command, and India and China have been traditional rivals in the area.
John Griffiths, we're seeing two narratives here. From China's perspective, the US is threatening global stability. From the US perspective, they're merely defending allies in the region. And China is becoming more of a destabilizing factor. Can both these things be true?
Well, yes, I mean, China obviously sees its military modernization, its military investment, its non-military activities such as the Belt and Road Initiative, which are aimed at building strategic and economic influence primarily. All these go hand in hand and are part of China's strong development that we've seen over the past few years, and this will continue. And so this white paper is part of the process of laying down the foundation and laying down the marker as to where China's position in the global between the global powers is. It's saying to the US, we're here. We're a dominant player in the region, and we will continue and expand our power over the coming decade. And the lines that it's put in the sand today with this white paper, certainly in terms of Taiwan, is a warning, and one that will be understood in the US. But the US will obviously not stand down. So it means that there will be a requirement for diplomacy and for discussions and negotiations, and also threats and concerns about misunderstandings in some of the region, so that there is there is a place for two, but it requires a certain level of diplomacy, because neither of these two powers, the US and China, are going away anytime soon. In this region and beyond.
There's certainly not, and it gives rise to the question. I mean, how likely are we to see some kind of military intervention? Because already the US and China are in the middle of a trade war. Neither side look willing to back down. Does this increase a risk of a military confrontation?
Not immediately, I don't think, because there is an understanding that what's happening at the moment, certainly in areas like the South China Sea, where China's military power has grown to such an extent that its deterrence has also grown, which means that the chances of military engagement have decreased. So China's military power has increased at such a rate that the chances of any real military conflict has probably decreased with some certain regional players. However, that's not the US, and that's where the complication is. And the real danger, I think, is misunderstandings, miscalculations about patrols and the areas that they do patrols. That is probably an area that is of concern. But diplomacy will be a key aspect going forward for these two nations.
Adam Nee, just how far do you think China is prepared to go with regard to Taiwan? We heard in that press conference the spokesperson saying we're willing to go to war. Do you think we can take that statement at face value?
I think it's hard to judge that. I mean, China has been consistently saying for a long time now that it's willing to go to war over Taiwan. But I think ultimately the cardinal principle that animates Chinese behavior at home, as well as its policy abroad, is the need to keep the Chinese Communist Party in power. So if it comes to Taiwan or the collapse of the Communist Party, then I think they wouldn't go to war. But in other scenarios, you can imagine where the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy is threatened, and it's been put into a really tough spot where it feels that military action is its only way out. So I think that's the kind of scenario that will potentially have escalation implications and very tragic consequences.
Lawrence Korb, a similar question to you. How far is the US prepared to go when it comes to support for Taiwan, given these red lines and markers have really been drawn in the sand with this white paper?
Well, there's no doubt about the fact that the U.S. would come to Taiwan's aid if the Chinese should be foolish enough to try and integrate it using military force. Obviously, nobody wants that, because nobody's going to win if that happens. Similarly, the United States and China have to be careful they don't have an accidental escalation when we're conducting patrols in the area and they're trying to, build runways on these islands that they're claiming. And I think that's the real danger, as well as the fact that something could happen in North Korea, given what's going on there, their missile buildup, the fact that we're putting missiles in South Korea, theoretically, to defend against North Korea, but the Chinese see them as undermining their nuclear deterrent. So those are the things I think you have to be very, very careful about, and make sure that we maintain lines of communication so an accidental encounter does not spiral into a conflict that nobody really wants.
Absolutely. But things, Lawrence Korb, do seem to be deteriorating in terms of the rhetoric building up with this trade war going on. The Chinese are using very much more robust rhetoric when it comes to outlining their position in this white paper. Do you think this will be ringing alarm bells in Washington, the release of this white paper? Do you think in the US there is a recognition that they are not going to be the only superpower in town?
Well, I think it will reinforce the American national security strategy, which said, we have two major strategic competitors, China and Russia, and China is the more potent one, and that's why we've had to increase our defense spending, which in real terms, even if you control for inflation, is higher than at the height of the Reagan buildup or during World War II. So it will feed into that narrative and make it hard for people who say we're focusing too much on defense and not enough on diplomacy to win the day.
Adam Nee, do you think we are looking at a new Chinese military superpower? Already China is very strong economically. Is this the next frontier?
Indeed, I think Xi Jinping has made it abundantly clear that China is looking for a superpower status when it comes to its military force. The white paper clearly highlights that the People's Liberation Army is not where Beijing wants it to be. It acknowledges that tremendous modernization and reform has already happened, but it also says that it still lags behind world-leading militaries, and I think that's what China's military were working towards, and it's got milestones in 2020, 2035, and of course to become the world-leading military by 2050. So indeed, we're looking at China's pursuit of that military superstardom. It's another matter to kind of evaluate whether that is possible in the time frame given by Xi Jinping.
OK, and to you, John Gravatt, we're coming to the end of our discussion. Just give me your thoughts. Are we looking now at two military superpowers, the US and China, or will the US remain dominant in this regard?
At the moment, the US is dominant in this regard and will remain so for the foreseeable future, certainly for the near term. And as was stated just now, the Chinese military has certain goals that it wants to achieve by the mid-2030s and 2050s. And I think by that time, on the trajectory that China is on at the moment, with the investment that China has committed and is committing to military modernization, there will be a different scope and a different level of military power available to the Chinese government at that period. At the moment, the US is ahead in terms of capabilities and technologies and understanding, but the Chinese is rapidly improving its capabilities very quickly.
Well, lots of food for thought there. I'd like to thank all of my guests, John Gravatt, Lawrence Korb and Adam Nee. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, just head to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story, or you can tweet me directly @Hala Mohieddin. But from me, for now, and the whole Inside Story team, it's bye-bye.